Okay, so today we're going to unpack something that honestly surprised me, like the staying power of good old-fashioned cash.
Yeah, it's interesting, right?
We're diving into this Federal Reserve paper. It's called Demand for U.S. Banknotes at Home and Abroad. You sent this my way.
I did.
And I have to admit, my first thought was who's using cash these days? But this paper, it makes a really good case that cash is far from dead.
It really does. And what I found fascinating is how much the demand for actual physical US dollars has been going up for decades now, which seems crazy when you think about how much we use, digital payments, cryptocurrency, all that.
It's true. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't even remember the last time I went to like an actual bank teller.
Right.
So why is it that cash, especially U.S. dollars, is so resilient, even like thriving in some parts of the world?
Well, it's a really interesting story that kind of shows how unique the US dollar is globally. You see, it's not just, people in America using cash. A big chunk of US dollars are actually circulating in other countries.
So it's not just like tourists taking a couple extra bills home with them after a trip.
Not even close. It's
Yeah.
really hard to estimate the exact amount. But even if you look at the lowest estimates, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars.
Wow.
And some estimates are even higher, like trillions.
Okay, so now I really want to know, why are people all over the world holding on to so much U.S. cash, especially those $100 bills? It seems like they're always at the center of this.
Well, the $100 bill, it's almost like it has this legendary status, like it represents safety and stability, especially in uncertain times. Think about it. Anytime there's some global crisis, maybe the economy is shaky or there's political upheaval, people get nervous, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
The stock market could crash, governments could freeze bank accounts, but that crisp $100 bill, that keeps its value and you can use it anywhere.
So it's like that emergency stash of cash people keep, but on like a global scale.
Exactly. And if you look back at history, it backs this up. The research points to specific events where this demand for US dollars, especially those $100 bills, it just went through the roof.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, well, think about the fall of the Berlin Wall, talk about global uncertainty, right? Suddenly there's a whole new world order forming, and people had no idea what was going to happen. So they turned to something stable, the US dollar. And the same thing happened with Y2K, and again during the 2008 financial crisis. Every time, the demand for US dollars, it just skyrocketed.
So it's almost like a measure of global anxiety.
Yeah.
When the world gets nervous, the demand for U.S. dollars goes up. It's like
Yeah.
people want something tangible, something they feel like they can control when everything else seems so unpredictable.
That is a great way to put it. And this is what leads us to how the researchers actually measured this demand for US dollars in other countries, because it's not exactly easy to track physical cash moving all over the world.
Right? Sounds
Sure.
tricky. So how do they do it? It's like a detective story trying to track something as slippery as cash.
You're telling me it takes some real creativity. But one of the methods they used was actually looking at our neighbors to the North, Canada.
Canada. Seems kind of random.
It might seem random, but it's actually really smart. Basically, they used Canada as a comparison. Their thinking was Canadians mainly use Canadian dollars, right?
Right.
So if you compare how much currency is used in Canada to how much is used in the US, and you account for differences in their economies, then you can start to see how much of the US dollar use is probably happening outside the United States.
So they're using Canada as a benchmark, like a financial mirror almost, to see what U.S. cash use would look like without that global demand. That's really clever.
It is, and it shows you how economists, have to get creative when they're using real-world data to try and understand these complicated trends. And that's just one method they used. They also looked into international banknote shipments. There's this whole data set that tracks U.S. dollars moving between countries.
Wait, so they can actually see like shipments of $100 bills leaving the U.S. and where they end up? That is straight out of a movie.
Well, it's not quite that precise.
Yeah.
They can see which countries are bringing in a lot of U.S. dollars. But even then, it's not always so simple. Like, some countries get massive amounts of U.S. dollars through official channels, but then very little of it seems to flow back out.
Okay, now that sounds like something shady is going on. Where's all that cash going?
Right. It suggests there's this whole hidden network of cash moving outside the regular banking system.
Wow.
Like tourists bringing in cash, informal economies, migrant workers sending money back home. It's all part of this very complex system.
So those dollars, they kind of enter through the front door, but then they circulate within those economies and never really come back through the banks or other systems where they can be tracked. Makes sense, but it also makes it almost impossible to know how much U.S. cash is really out there.
Exactly. It's just much harder to track physical money than it is to track digital transactions. It's adaptable, untraceable sometimes.
Which brings us back to that idea of control and security that we were talking about before. If you're worried about the economy, or you think your government might suddenly restrict access to your money, having physical U.S. dollars tucked away somewhere, that gives you options and security that you just can't get any other way.
Absolutely. And this is another thing the research talks about, how extreme events really highlight all of this. Remember back at the beginning of the pandemic?
Oh, yeah. Empty shelves at the store, people waiting in huge lines outside the banks. It was a strange time.
For sure. ATMs were running out of money, and everyone was suddenly worried about whether they could get cash when they needed it. Even with things like Apple Pay and Venmo, people instinctively wanted the security of having actual physical cash.
That's true. It's like that old saying, cash is king. No matter how digital the world gets, when things go haywire, it's that cash that people want.
Exactly. And the data shows that too. In 2020, the demand for US dollars, especially the larger denominations, it went way up.
Yeah.
People wanted that safety net, that feeling of security, knowing they could still get to their money no matter what was happening with the banks or online systems.
It makes sense. It's like when the power goes out and everyone suddenly remembers where they put their old flashlights. Cash is kind of like our reliable backup system.
That's a great analogy. But it's not just about the $100 bill either. Even though those get a lot of attention, the research also found that $20 bills, those are really important around the world too, especially in developing economies.
So the $100 bill is like the star of the show for global reserves and big money moves. But the 20, it's like the workhorse, the everyday hero for a lot of people, especially in those developing economies, right?
It is. I mean, think about it. In a lot of those places, $100, that's a lot of money for a single purchase. And using smaller bills just wouldn't be practical if you need to carry around larger sums. The 20 hits that sweet spot.
Yeah, it's accessible, but still holds its value. It makes you realize that for a lot of people in these economies, that $20 bill, it's not just about convenience. It's like their ticket into participating in a global system.
That's a great way to put it. It really shows you just how far the impact of the US dollar goes, from these huge financial markets all the way down to, like you said, everyday life.
It is really fascinating. But all this talk about digital currency and a cashless society, it makes you wonder, what does the future hold for actual physical cash?
Right. That's the big question. This research doesn't exactly give us a clear answer, but it does point to some interesting patterns, like how even though the demand for US dollars globally is up, here in the US, we're actually using less and less of it, especially the smaller bills.
So maybe here in the US, we are moving towards a less cash-dependent system.
Mhm.
But globally, the demand for those dollars, particularly the Benjamins, that's not going away anytime soon, is it?
It doesn't seem like it. The US dollar is still the king, the world's leading reserve currency. It represents stability, reliability, a way to protect yourself against uncertainty. Those are things that people will probably always want, even with all these new ways to use money digitally.
This has been really eye-opening. We started talking about something as simple as cash, but it's taken us to all these different places: global economics, human psychology, trust in financial systems, how people act in a crisis.
Absolutely. It makes you think about all those people out there holding on to these huge amounts of US dollars. What are their stories? Why are they doing it?
Yeah, it's like we've stumbled onto this whole hidden world underneath the official financial system, a world where cash is king, where borders don't seem to matter as much, and where the U.S. dollar is the most powerful force.
Definitely makes you look at that dollar bill a little differently. It's not just money anymore. It's a tiny piece of something much bigger.
It really is. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of cash.
It's been a pleasure exploring all of this with you.
And thank you all for listening. We'll catch you next time.